years and working with KRB. My first day of work was when everything shut down from the pandemic. So that was interesting. As you all know, with nonprofits, there was a complete pivot, and Keep Roswell Beautiful has been working the past 2 years to reinvigorate ourselves in the organization. Prior to working for the city, I did a short bout in ecological landscaping with a group down in Decatur. So I have a little bit of hands-on experience when it comes to planning landscapes that are meant for wildlife. But before that, I served almost a decade with Atlanta Audubon Society, which is now the Georgia Audubon Society. I spent a couple years as their education coordinator, but most of the time I was the executive director. So like Ben mentioned, I have a degree in wildlife conservation and a master's in environmental education, and I'm more of a generalist. So today I'm gonna fake being a plant person. As much as I love to think I know so much about native plants, I'm more of a wildlife person first. But the thing is that wildlife needs native plants. And so I've come to love the challenge of learning about plants. I am a member of Georgia Native Plant Society. They're kind of friends to the wildlife folks. So today I'm going to do my best to share some of my knowledge, things that I've learned over the years. I am going to focus today on National Wildlife Federation's community habitat program. Now, I know many of you know about this because you are gardeners. Here in the city of Roswell and also in city of Alpharetta, this program is available to all of the community. So what that means is when you drive into the city of Roswell at some of the main points, you'll see a sign that says that Roswell is a certified community habitat. And the way that happened is through private property owners and public spaces like East Roswell Park. Part of it is certified as a backyard wildlife habitat. And when you get so many of those together, the National Wildlife Federation recognizes your community as certified as good for wildlife. So I am going to use that as the basis to talk about wildlife and native plants today, because that program is like the gateway drug into yard certifications. I'm sure many of you have looked into different signage you can add to your garden. There's pollinator certifications. There is bird-friendly certifications. Georgia Native Plant Society has a program which is pretty rigorous for native plant recognition. But this National Wildlife Program is a good first step because it doesn't ask too much of you and your garden. So let me quickly tell you a little bit about Keep Roswell Beautiful. We are a 501c3, and we are the nonprofit arm for the City of Roswell's environmental programs. So I actually report to the Department of Environmental Public Works, and I work with that staff to provide stewardship programs and educational programs to the entire community. Our mission at KRB is to cultivate environmental stewardship in the Roswell community. That's kind of a wide berth, but we felt when we went through our recent strategic planning that this is how we felt like we're kind of the group that people can turn to when they have questions about doing more green things for the city of Roswell. We are a part of the Keep Georgia Beautiful network, which is a part of the Keep America Beautiful network. So there are about 70 affiliates like us in the state of Georgia doing this hard work. By the way, this picture is our Earth balloon. I don't know if any of you have seen it or any of your kids or grandkids have been inside the Earth balloon, but later today, I'm going to be scurrying out of here to get ready to set that up. Later today, it is a fantastic tool that Keep Roswell Beautiful purchased that I get to use to help teach environmental topics. So a few things that we do, we have many stewardship programs that we conduct in partnership with the City of Roswell. One many people recognize is the Adopt a Road program. I'm the coordinator for that. So if y'all are interested in that, please reach out. We also host a variety of cleanup and litter pickup type events, such as the Great American Cleanup, which is kicking off this weekend, and Rivers Alive, which has been a Roswell tradition for many, many years. It's a fall timed cleanup all around the city. Last year we had over 200 people, and I think we collected more than 1 ton of litter. So that was really exciting. We also host other community science type programs such as Adopt a Stream, which is water quality monitoring. We do non-native invasive plant removal. This picture here was just taken a couple weeks ago. This is the entire Roswell High School soccer teams, and they pulled out privet, ivy, bittersweet. It was amazing. They are standing in the dumpster where they put it all. So service groups want to do this type of work, and I'm happy to help them with our public lands and our privet issue. We also do Christmas tree recycling. So about a week or two after Christmas at the Home Depots, we help collect Christmas trees to be repurposed into mulch. And like I showed you before, we do some educational programs such as this, but also we do focus on youth with our earth balloon, talking about water, habitat, and watershed quality.
Keep going.
Okay, so let's talk about plants. So from the wildlife perspective, oh, and by the way, I do want to mention, the National Wildlife Certification Program is coordinated by me. And Keep Roswell Beautiful's job is to try to get the word out there about this program, because what we've found is we've maintained our certification for almost 10 years, but still only a limited number of citizens know about this program. So that's another reason why I am presenting, with this foundation of the NWF program. So plants are the foundation of any food web in an ecosystem. That is why plants and wildlife have such a close relationship, and it is so important for us to think about what we're putting out there in our yard. How many of you, just a show of hands, are familiar with Dr. Doug Tallamy and his work? Yes. So when I asked that question 5, 6, 7 years ago, I would get like 1 or 2 hands, which tells me that his work is getting out there. Dr. Tallamy is an entomologist up in Delaware, and he has published 3 or 4 books just on the importance of native plants and their ability to provide food for insects. Particularly, he focused on lepidopterans, so butterflies and moths. But what he found was that if this relationship between plants and insects continues to break apart, we're going to be in real big trouble with our basic ecosystem systems and services. And so Dr. Tallamy has worked the last couple decades on bringing this information to light, just this basic information. And so they're critical in the food web, whichever way you go. If you're going down into, they are eating plants and things are eating insects. So 90% of the insects that rely on plants, they can only survive on the plants that they evolved with. And that's why native plants are so critical to this process. So as you all probably know, native plants are really great to have in your yard. They're easier to manage. They've adapted to the local soils that are already there. They've also adapted to the local weather and climate conditions, and they change as those things change. So native plants are quite resilient. And once they get established, they're very hardy because they're supposed to be growing under these conditions. And most importantly for today, they are the key to supporting wildlife. So in Dr. Tallamy's work, he actually discovered that oaks, the group of plants, oaks, are the most important type of plant that you can have in your yard. And what's cool about Georgia is that we've got so many different types of oaks. Now, there are specific species that rank up there. I believe white oak is one of the top species. So if you have white oak in your yard, hooray. But in general, the reason oaks are such an important group is that Dr. Tellamy found that oaks can support 557 species of caterpillars. So your butterflies and your moths in their larval stages. And you know who loves to eat caterpillars are birds and other types of wildlife. So oaks are super important. Doug Tellamy does a whole presentation just on oaks if you're interested. Now, when we think about what we plant in our yard, so I live here in Roswell, and on our street, we actually have a single ginkgo tree. And it is gorgeous, right? Especially when it turns that beautiful yellow color. And I love seeing it every year, and my kids love seeing it. But the unfortunate thing is it does not support any species of native caterpillars. So you can see the difference just by having an oak tree or a native oak tree and having a non-native tree, how that immediately sets a difference between how you're supporting the beautiful wildlife in your yard. So the bottom line is wildlife needs native plants, okay? And the way that we wildlife advocates like to think about gardening is that the act of planting for a purpose is the definition of gardening. So every plant you put in the ground has a purpose, has a meaning for being there. Perhaps you're planting a historical plant. You're planting daffodils for a certain reason to represent something in history. You can also use native plants and plant them with a purpose for butterflies, for moths, for beetles. So when I talk about wildlife, I'm talking about all different types of wildlife, and habitat gardens can attract all sorts of wildlife, especially here in North Fulton, where we've had a lot of development over the last 30 or 40 years, and we're starting to live side by side with wildlife, our deer, our fox, and everything else. So when I'm talking about wildlife, I'm describing everything from, say, a hummingbird and butterflies and moths to songbirds, to mammals, to snakes, to frogs, to salamanders. So the whole array. And here, and since I worked for Audubon and I am a bird admirer and a bird watcher, these are some of the birds that you're probably going to see in your yard. This is just a few. I included the great blue heron because oftentimes I hear from people who have detention ponds in their neighborhood, in their backyard, or a creek, and they tell me, I couldn't believe it, I had great blue heron in my backyard. Well, that means you have a healthy ecosystem if they're able to fish in that creek, and that creek has clean enough water to support fish. That means there are plants nearby that are filtering the pollution from stormwater runoff, right? So I'll just go through quickly because people always ask, what bird is that? What bird is that? We have a red-shouldered hawk, and right now they are in mating season. So do any of you guys have red-shouldered hawks that are, yeah, me too, yep. We have a barred owl. Last night I was at city council meeting in downtown Roswell, and wouldn't you know, a barred owl flew right in front of City Hall as I was leaving. So, you know, you look at City Hall in Roswell, there's a lot of trees, and I know that there's been a lot of work done at Smith Plantation in terms of supporting plants and native plants. Well, we had proof last night of a barred owl right in front of that property. But then you have your cardinals, your eastern bluebirds, the little yellow bird. Does anyone know what that is? It is not a goldfinch. It's a pine warbler. So just a quick note about warblers. There can be up to 32 species of warblers alone that come through Georgia. Most of them are not going to come down to your feeder. A pine warbler will. But if you have multiple layers of plants, of native plants in your yard, you're going to attract a good half of that, a good dozen types of those species of warblers during migration, because they take up different spaces from the canopy level to shrub level to ground level. So if you plant it, they will come, and that makes migration season super exciting for those of us who like to see birds. And of course, blue jays, chickadees. If you have any questions about birds, I'd be happy to answer them. You can send me an email and I'd be happy to answer. But again, in order to support and recognize that you've done a great job planting for wildlife, we have this certified wildlife habitat program. And what I've learned, and when I worked at Audubon, we had a yard recognition program as well. And it was a great starting point for people to jump into other things. And what a lot of folks said was that, well, my neighbors started asking me questions about my yard and about my plants, about the flowers, about the birds that are at my feeder when they saw the sign. So that's why something like yard recognition is really important. If you have a garden that meets these requirements and is worth showing off, I highly encourage you to look into the National Wildlife Certification Program. So let's talk about what you need in order to get your yard certified. Well, of course, you need food. Here are a couple great examples. Here's your American goldfinch on the left. You can see it's feeding off of sunflowers. Sunflowers, native sunflowers, are some of the best plants you can put in your yard, and they're so pretty because they do provide those seeds for seed-eating birds and other creatures. On the right, those are a bird called cedar waxwings. Now here in Georgia, they are winter visitors. And as you can see, they're gobbling up, that looks like it might be wintergreen. They're gobbling up berries. When they come to Georgia in the wintertime, they are looking for food. That is why they are here. In fact, one great thing to remember about when you're planting with purpose is that you're creating food so that wildlife has something to eat, and they are driven by the availability of food. Just like my son is driven by the snacks that I have in the pantry downstairs, he will come out of his cave and come downstairs and find the food. And then when it's gone, he'll retreat, right? It's the same thing with all animals. They are driven by food. So if you provide it, you're going to see this beautiful bird up close. And they are one of the most fantastic birds to see in person. Now you want to look at a variety of types of food. For butterflies, for moths, and for certain types of flies, the dipterans, the sweat bees, things like that, you want to provide nectar, and you want to be able to provide pollen. And you want to think about the seasonality of when you're planting. So right now in my yard, I've got some golden groundsel that's in bloom. I'm not sure if y'all know what that looks like, but it is has a tall stem and a yellow flower, and it blooms in early spring for the early pollinators. And then later on in the summer, I have other things like salvias that come up, and they provide food for the pollinators that have emerged and have hatched on their first year later on in the summer. And then in the fall, I'll have things like coneflower, some daisies and asters that come up, and they're in bloom for the fall pollinators. So the point is to provide food throughout the growing season if you can. In the middle, of course, we have hummingbirds here in Georgia. The ruby-throated hummingbird is the most common one you're going to see. Any other hummingbird you see that's not a ruby-throated would likely show up in the wintertime. And it does happen. And those of us who are bird watchers will literally go to people's backyards to see them because it's a pretty fun event. However, ruby-throated hummingbirds, they make that big journey across the Gulf of Mexico, and they land in Georgia. Now they're in South Georgia and Alabama and Florida. Their next stop is Metro Atlanta. So a great thing to think about is what plants can I offer for this hummingbird, this tiny little thing that just flew thousands of miles across the Gulf of Mexico. Things like coral honeysuckle, sages and salvias, those are great plants to think about for your hummingbirds. and hummingbird moths, which is that insect on the side, on the right-hand side. Now, I brought this slide back up because if you've read Doug Tallamy's work, or if you've read any articles about native plants, you've probably seen the information about chickadees. There was a study done probably about 10 years now that showed that a single chickadee family needed to collect 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars per brood of babies. So if you put that into perspective, think about the space in your yard. If you're like me, you have, under an acre of land. This is your palette. And this is where, and for me, when I plant to bring birds and insects in because that's my passion. So when I'm thinking about what we replace or put in the ground, I'm thinking about plants that are going to support caterpillars because chickadee is one of my favorite birds. And to think about how much energy and how much it takes for a bird to collect food. If you watch them, they come back and forth and back and forth. The closer the food is to the nest, the less energy they're going to burn, okay? And that increases their survival. So it's just something to think about when you're thinking about how you're gonna plant with purpose. And of course, there are other ways that plants supply food. This bird on the left is not one native to Georgia, but we do have a type of sapsucker. They literally drill into the side of, we have yellow-bellied sapsuckers. This is I can't remember which species this is, but it's a Western species. They're tapping in for the sap in a tree trunk. And there's other ways that insects and birds and even amphibians and other invertebrates utilize plants for food. So you have to think about all the different ways that they use food. And then we also have to remember that we are supporting that full life cycle in an ecosystem. So when you're planting with purpose, you might be providing a direct food resource for an insect or for a bird, but then you're supporting the rest of the food web. So you're supporting this garter snake eating this green tree frog that you have in your yard, which has totally happened in my yard. I don't know about you guys, but I have a rain barrel. The green tree frogs hang out around the rain barrel, and we caught a snake hunting the green tree frog. It was pretty cool. And again, birds of prey like owls and hawks, and even in Roswell, down by the river, we have eagles. We're kind of supporting this bigger food web by planting with purpose. I always mention a little bit about bird feeding because a lot of times gardeners are also bird feeders. And what I wanted to say about that is bird feeding is for us. So if you buy bird seed, suet, you put out mealworms for the bluebirds, you put out a nectar feeder for hummingbirds. The time of year when they need that most is right now. So between late January and right before spring, when food resources here in Georgia are scarce. So there aren't a whole lot of seeds available. The berries have been picked over. And you'll see if you do have bird feeders and you only have one bird feeder filled and the rest are empty, you're gonna have a lot of birds coming this time of year. And squirrels and other mammals we're not gonna mention today. This time of year is the key time. If you like feeding the birds with bird food that you buy, this is the key time to do it. Otherwise, it is an activity for us to admire birds. They do not need to have a bird feeder. Now, in the certification for your yard, this does count as one way that you can provide food. But I always mention you don't have to have a bird feeder to meet that requirement because you're planting with purpose, right? You have a plant that's providing food already. But if you like to see birds up close, I highly recommend it. Okay, speaking of water, I'm just going to take a quick swig. How many of you have ponds or creeks in your yard? Great. Water is a requirement for you to get your yard certified. And sometimes that can be hard because here in Georgia, it immediately attracts mosquito larvae. But I can attest to you that water is quite necessary to have in your yard, even if it is literally just the top of a large cottage cheese lid that puddles water for moths and butterflies to feed off of, or if you have a little area where you can put out a large dish or a water bath for birds. They really need that water source, especially in the summertime. You'll see birds and you'll see mammals come, and frogs come right up to whatever water source you have, and they're going to be using it. And they're using it at night as well. So that's why providing water is so important. Oftentimes, if you're lucky enough to be able to have a fountain that you can add into your garden with a little pump, birds like a hummingbird will come and kind of hover around it and fly in and out. So while you're thinking about the design of your garden, you can also think about the function. When water makes noise, it's going to attract wildlife like birds, but it's also going to kind of create a little play area for them as well. And of course, creatures like amphibians, most importantly frogs, but also salamanders, they rely on a water resource in order to survive. So it is really, that's why it is a requirement to gain that yard recognition. I love this picture of the butterflies because it shows how they're using a water resource that we don't even realize is there. So many times, I know in my yard, I have a lot of shade and I have a lot of damp areas sometimes after a rain. Insects like butterflies, they do this behavior called puddling, and they will use their mouth parts to gather up any moisture they can from these moist, damp areas. Now you can create your own puddling situation with a bunch of rocks or river rocks and a planter. As long as you keep some of those rocks above water, you're gonna get insects coming to puddle. But what I think is neat is you may not see the resources you're providing for your wildlife, but they know what to do. So that's why we need to think about our ecosystems up and down and horizontally as well. Those of you with a detention pond, perhaps in your neighborhood or in your backyard, these areas can be really important to wildlife. And here in Roswell, I see a lot of animals like bullfrogs, green frogs. We'll get blackbirds, song sparrows. They all use this type of area as their habitat. And what I wanted to mention is that in this picture, you can see there is vegetation all the way up to the water's edge. One of the practices that can harm wildlife populations in your yard is by not creating that buffer next to the water. Not only does that prevent erosion, but it also allows the plants to filter any of the chemicals that might be coming off a lawn or driveways. So it is important, if you do have a pond area, to try and maintain vegetation along that pond's edge. Now, the third requirement for a National Wildlife Yard recognition is cover. So plants are very important for providing cover for many animals from predators, and here in Georgia, from the elements. So that storm we had the other night where we woke up Saturday morning and it was snowing and there were, 30 to 40 mile per hour wind gusts. That's where planting with purpose can really help. If you have trees like junipers and cedars, even pine trees, they provide great cover for wildlife during our crazy weather happenings that occur here in Georgia. You can see here, does anyone know what this bird is? That's right, it's a mourning dove taking cover. You can see it's also camouflaged. So not only is it taking cover, but it's kind of camouflaged, hiding it from other birds. And I don't know about you all, but my red-shouldered hawks have definitely chased the mourning doves in my yard. So cover is really important to wildlife. And both prey and predators need cover. So we have to remember that we are supporting that whole food web when we're planting with purpose. It's really cool to see all the adaptations of animals with plants. On the left here is it looks like a green anole that's camouflaged on a plant, and then the multiple types of spiders that hide in the foliage or in the blooms of many of our native plants. So one of the things I think we all struggle with is what our native plant and wildlife gardens look like. Sometimes it can be perceived as messy or perhaps, untamed a bit. One of the planting strategies that you can think about is planting densely in one area, so that you create kind of a connected microhabitat in one part of your yard. And it becomes manageable for you to take care of, especially if you live in a neighborhood that does have HOA guidelines and requires you to keep at least, your front yard, well kept and under certain guidelines. One of the strategies you can employ is to plant densely. And that's where it gets really fun when you're thinking about design, because you can think about which plants bloom when. So when you're planting, like in this picture, it looks like this is probably in the summertime with the cone flowers and the looks like mountain mint or sage in the background. But if you think about your planting design and concentrate on one area and have food availability, spring, summer, fall, and winter if you can, that is one way that you can tackle that, native plants make things look ugly and unkept. It doesn't have to be that way if you do your homework and do a little bit of planning. And cover for wildlife can be things like snags, so standing dead trees, provide fantastic cover and food resources for lots of different types of animals. This pile of sticks on the left, I call it a wattle. That is something that's can be really important to lots of different animals besides chipmunks. Carolina wrens, eastern towhee, snakes and frogs, they all use this kind of pile of sticks as habitat. It's really an important feature. And if you're looking to create just a little bit of cover in your yard, you could make even the small pile of sticks somewhere off to the side, that is providing key habitat. And that would count towards cover in the National Wildlife Yard recognition. Can you even see the animal in this picture? Sometimes I look at it and I can't see it, but it looks like there's a southern toad down there. Sometimes those edge areas where we have, we leave our leaves, right? And there's some plants and sticks and old trees on the ground. Again, this is critical habitat for things like toads, salamanders, and a whole slew of insects that need that damp cover on the ground in order to survive. They're part of the ecosystem too. And look, all you had to do was just leave your leaves. You didn't have to do anything to earn that credit. And finally, the fourth piece of certifying your yard is showing that you have places for wildlife to raise young. One of the things we've really started hearing more about are native bees. Native bees are in decline. Hopefully you all are connected with Becky Griffin. I think she's through the UGA extension and she does the the Georgia Great Pollinator Census. If not, I would be happy to connect you to that program. Native bees are critical in our Georgia ecosystems, and they have different types of habitat needs. This particular bee is a ground nester, and many times these bees are solitary. So they need kind of these open dirt areas that you and I are ignoring, right? We put it off to the side like, okay, I'll deal with that another time. actually insects like ground nesting bees utilize that space to raise their young. Plants are critical when for things like birds in terms of creating nesting areas. So not all birds have a traditional nest. On the right-hand side there, you can see the great horned owl. They're literally just in the cavity of a tree. Our red-shouldered hawks we talked about earlier, they'll create a kind of a giant stick nest platform that is a great place to raise young. And then, you know, things like woodpeckers, they need certain size trees in order to create their nest. So this picture in the middle, the pileated woodpecker, they require wider trees than say something like a downy woodpecker, which requires a much narrower in width tree. So that's another fun thing to think about. What are the widths of the trees in my yard? Am I providing habitat for, you know, good habitat for woodpeckers and nuthatches? We can also, in this National Wildlife Program, provide nest boxes for birds. Not all birds use nest boxes. In fact, there's just a few here in Georgia. The birds that are gonna nest in a box are your Carolina wrens, your eastern bluebirds, Carolina chickadees, tufted titmice. You will get screech owls if you're lucky enough. They've really declined over the years. And then a few others. So when you're thinking about providing cover in places for birds and other creatures to raise young, you don't have to put up a bird box, but that certainly counts towards providing places to raise young. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the effect that humans can have on wildlife in regards to places to raise young. So this is an eastern bluebird. How many of you all have bluebird boxes in your yard? Yeah, that goes right along with gardening, I've noticed. The past couple weeks, our bluebird pair is starting to move back into our nest box. And they will come back year after year. Now, back in the, I want to say in the 80s, 70s and 80s, eastern bluebirds were on the brink of becoming listed as rare or endangered in the United States. And the thing that saved them was people putting up nest boxes, because scientists learned that they will readily nest in a nest box, which not all birds do. And if controlled and keeping invasive species out, so not an invasive exotic plant, but an animal called a house sparrow, keeping that bird from taking away that nesting habitat, you know, like invading and taking over the space, we were able to bring eastern bluebirds back in our own backyards. So right now there is a really good example of a bird that needs that kind of help. It's called the brown-headed nuthatch, and I forgot to add a slide about that. But this is a bird that's endemic to the Southeast. It's that little bird that sounds like the dog squeaky toy up in the pine trees. So you can do a lot of service to that bird by keeping, I know pine trees are the first to go when we're thinking about safety. But if you can keep one in your yard, those nuthatches are really going to appreciate it. They also they take to a nest box. So that is another example of how people can help support wildlife in their yard and have a direct effect on saving a species. And of course, we have other creatures who we want to encourage in our yard that maybe, you know, aren't the prettiest creatures, but super important things like bats. Putting a bat house up also counts towards the National Wildlife certification. I know we have a couple in our yard, and it's fantastic to watch them in the summertime.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Where do you get bat houses? I don't know anything about how to make one or.
Sure. So the Georgia Wildlife Federation and DNR have plans. I'd be happy to share those, but I'm pretty sure Birdwatcher Supply, which is on Mansell Road, and then Wild Birds Unlimited over in Alpharetta.
Right.
Oh, and there's a new one in Crabapple. Check with them. And then other places, we want to think about our water resources. So we want to encourage things like frogs to have places, if we are lucky enough to have a little pond in our yard, making sure that water is clean so that amphibians can have their babies. I think what's interesting, I mentioned earlier, Keep Roswell Beautiful does water quality monitoring, and we really do see these other stages of life that animals that we see flying in our gardens, right? They started off somewhere else. So a good example of that is a dragonfly. They start their life in water, and dragonflies and damselflies are good indicators of the type of water quality that we have in our creeks and our streams. They start their lives out as an egg and their larval stages in our local creeks. And if they make it, they emerge from the creeks, and then they rely on our backyards to do their hunting because they are predators. They are looking for other invertebrates to eat. So again, it's another dimension of thinking of how can I support the life that's in my neighborhood? Perhaps you have a creek in your neighborhood that runs down to one of our larger creeks. Our water quality, what you do in your yard, really makes a difference in terms of who is actually living and surviving in our local ecosystems. Finally, some of the other check boxes you'll see when you fill out a form for the National Wildlife Habitat certification is sustainable gardening. So thinking about the things that we put in our soils is really important because you know, the things that aren't used by plants, if we use too much fertilizer, for example, or if we use in general insecticides, that is breaking the chain of an ecosystem and a food web that is really important to think twice about. So National Wildlife asks you to commit to sustainable gardening, also water conservation, things like that. And just so you know, the process for getting your yard certified is pretty easy. You go onto the National Wildlife website and you get to fill out a form. There's a checklist, and you basically walk around in your yard and you say, okay, I've got the food. I've got three examples. I've got three examples of food. I've got a water resource. You know, I've got examples of cover. And you go through the form and you submit that form. There is a $20 fee for the certification, and then you get a sign like the one right in the middle. And I know I have one somewhere. But you get your sign, and then you install your sign, and then your neighbors are all like, oh, wow, you have a certified yard? That's cool. How did you do that? And then you get to tell them how easy it is. So this is what the website, the URL is. So you can go here to learn more about how to certify your yard. But I know Ben was telling me you all were a little interested in specifically for planting for birds. So this is a text-heavy slide. I thought I'd spend the last couple minutes just talking about how you can cater specifically to birds. So this picture here, man, that's boring, right? That is your palette. So when you're thinking about specifically planting for the purpose of supporting birds, we want to think about, again, that they are driven by food. That's why birds migrate. You know, we have many birds that live here year round, but there are birds that are starting their journey right now from Central and South America, coming back to Georgia or just stopping in Georgia because they know there is natural native food here for them. And so when you're thinking about planting for birds, there are a couple strategies you can take. When we're thinking about our yards and how, you know, we have our house and your neighbor's house and then the other neighbor's house, we create a lot of edges and dead space where there are no plants. So one thing we can do is really play off of that, enhancing our edge habitat, enhancing the space between driveways, between your backyard and your neighbor's backyard. It's actually an easier way to manage like your curb appeal, where you have two habitats that come together. you can use that and create a palette. And it also, because you have two different types of habitats, so say there's a wooded backyard and then there's a manicured backyard, if you can increase and enhance that area between, in this case, those trees and that manicured grass, if you can enhance that edge habitat with some shrubs, and with some wildflower plantings that are seasonal, you've done a huge service for birds. The other thing to think about is vertical layers. So I mentioned there are 30 or plus more species of warblers birds alone that will stop in Georgia during migration. Well, they're stopping here because we have multiple layers of plants. So we have warblers that only stop in the canopy, and they're only looking for those caterpillars and bugs that are eating the leaves of the tulip poplar, right at the tippity top. And then we have warblers that are kind of mid-story that are going to come in and they're looking for the insects that are in the shrub layer or maybe the mid canopy layer, like dogwood trees are a great example. You have your mid-level habitat where those different caterpillars are eating that the warblers are going to snag up and then be on their way. And then you think about your shrub layers and then your ground level layers and everything in between. We have a lot of control about that area in terms of gardeners. So that's a place where there's a real opportunity for us to provide food. We talked about planting seasonally. So for birds, having food for them in the winter and early spring is a top priority in Georgia. And then maybe thinking around that, what blooms and what starts leafing out early that's going to provide food for caterpillars that is then becomes food for birds. So thinking about that order of what's blooming when, what goes to seed when, those are all ways that you can support birds. I do want to note that when you're creating your list of plants, a great resource is National Audubon's Native Plant Database. You just go to audubon.org and look under the menu for plants for birds. It's got a really cool search option. You put in your zip code and it's going to bring up all the different types of plants that support birds. And it breaks it down by types of plants, and it also can break it down by the types of birds. So if you're trying to, say, attract northern cardinals to your yard, you can search for plants that support the northern cardinal. So it's a really fun way to shop for plants and to think about how to design your garden. And this is what most of us who like going shopping need, is a shopping list. What's best for birds? In the back, I left some handouts. There is 1 or 2 plant lists in those handouts. But people often ask, well, what's best for birds? This is kind of a combination of suggestions, not just from Doug Talmy, but from other wildlife biologists who over time have noted, okay, these species of plants support invertebrates, they support cover and nesting areas for birds, and they also provide interest in the garden. Okay, so for instance, cherries provide some beautiful blossoms, right? Dogwoods and mulberries offer a lot of interest, but they also offer a lot of great foods. Now, of course, we want to look for the native varieties of these plants. But for trees, these are kind of your top 10. If you have to take trees out in your yard, this is a good list to look at and see, okay, should I really take out that oak tree? Is it time for it to go? Then we have shrubs, which we, as gardeners, we have a lot of opportunity where our neighborhoods were landscaped with a lot of exotic shrubs and varieties. This isn't an opportunity for gardeners to, when it's time to replace those shrubs, to think about what a native option might be instead. So looking at, a lot of you like me have like a Chinese holly variety in front of their house. Well, when it's time to replace them, let's think about American holly or even winterberry or something like beautyberry if you have a lot of sun. One of the other challenges we run into is sun and shade. I would say about half of these shrubs they will grow fine in shade. But if you ever have any questions about that, you can ask me. And of course, all of those books out there will tell you, you know, what works and what doesn't. This is an American robin, and it looks like it is eating some winterberry right there. So that's a type of native holly that birds really like.
Can I ask you something?
Sure.
I just want to suggest that winterberry, not only is it advantageous, it's got one of the best fragrances you'll ever smell. It rivals Daphne.
Yeah, I mean, that is something as gardeners we think about, right? We're doing this to aesthetically please ourselves, right? So we want to put plants in that we love. You know, from this shrub list, one of my favorites is beautyberry. And you've got to be careful with beautyberry because there are cultivars where they've changed the size of the berry or where the berry is on the stem. I mean, science is amazing that you can do this. But if it's not the native variety, then the birds aren't going to know to eat it, right? Or if the berry's too large or it's too glossy, like there's too many, they've changed the consistency of the berry a bit to last longer. It ends up not being food for birds. So that's why having the native variety of a plant is important, because that is what the animals have evolved with. Cultivars are a whole other conversation. And I am not experienced enough to address that, although I know plenty of experts around here that can. But when it comes to animals, if you have changed the size or shape or way to access the food. So for instance, with a honeysuckle, if the tube of the flower is too long and a hummingbird can't get the nectar, then you haven't really done anything for wildlife, right? So you have to stick with the native version of these plants. Then you have all your native wildflowers. Here's a top list that over the years, me and my wildlife friends have encouraged people to plant. Again, these are, asters are a really important one because they bloom in the fall. And as insects and birds are kind of wrapping up their seasonal activities, asters provide great food resource and cover resource. In terms of native vines, I always want to encourage you to keep your Virginia creeper because it does die back, right? Once it gets cold. It actually provides berries for birds like the thrushes, the robins, the thrushes, and other birds that are kind of mid-canopy birds. And then for ground covers, that's a tough one because we're always looking for, I mean, if you can do anything for wildlife, it would be to replace a small patch of grass, of turf grass. But it's hard to find ground covers that really work. You know, some don't like shade, some do like shade, some don't like dampness. This list lists the ones that people have the most success with. I mentioned golden groundsel. That is taken really well to my Roswell yard. And green and gold, which I think it's a chrysanthemum. I can't remember the scientific name, but that is a fantastic ground cover. Not only does it spread in an area, but it is very hardy. And if you walk on it and you've got kids that are stomping on it, these plants are really good for that. So I'm going to wrap up. I just wanted to give my contact information. If you'd like to learn more about Keep Roswell Beautiful, this is our website. We do have our own membership, and we have a fantastic event in the fall called the Great Annual Duck Race, where we take plastic ducks and we race them down Big Creek. So maybe we'll all be involved together with that later on this year. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, and I think we're going to be starting things like TikTok and kind of fun things like that as well. So I encourage you to reach out to me with any questions you may have. If I don't know the answer, I usually know someone who does when it comes to the native plants and wildlife. So thank you very much for your time today. Yes.
Is 50 feet enough separation for two bluebird nests?
No. So when you're thinking about putting up nest boxes, that's pretty close. If birds are desperate, they will live next to each other, but not of the same species in general. So you'd probably want more like 50 yards instead of 50 feet. Yes.
Are you familiar with mosquito dunk?
Are those the things you put in the water in your water bath? I've never used them. I use a water wiggler. You guys know what a water wiggler is?
Yes.
So for those who don't, it is literally a little stir that I put in the center of my water bath, and it keeps the water moving so that the insects can't land and lay their eggs. A water wiggler. You can get them on Amazon or at like the bird watcher supply stores. Oh yeah, it's literally just a little twirly thing, and you put it in the middle and they'll perch along the edge. Yeah.
$35.
Yes.
I wish Roswell would get the word out about the dangers of mosquito spray, because I take
Yeah.
birds and insects, and my neighbors spray for mosquitoes.
Yes.
Everything I talk to.
So that's a tough one for me as a city employee to answer. I will say, you know, when we have parks, I think that there's some spraying going on. In terms of as a private citizen, yes, the mosquito insecticide is a general chemical, which means it is killing other things and not just mosquitoes. So I highly recommend not spraying. I can put you in contact with someone I know in Atlanta who has done campaigns about mosquito spray and leaf blowers. You know, they kind of go hand in hand. Noise pollution and chemical pollution. That stuff is toxic. It's terrible. Yes. Yep.
Excuse us, Nikki, for the Zoom and the recording, can you repeat the questions? We're only hearing your answer. Thank you.
So the city's probably not going to do that, but I will take that into consideration for Keep Roswell Beautiful. Well, I mean, I think that's something that if you're concerned about it, bring it up to a city councilor. That's the venue for getting issues addressed. However, that's why groups like us and Keep Roswell Beautiful, you could talk to my board about putting information into our newsletters about that and perhaps into papers and things like that. So
People just don't understand.
no, people don't understand. So the question was, I'm going to repeat these for the Zoom. The question was, or it was more of a comment, that Roswell should communicate the dangers of using mosquito sprayers. And I agree, those are chemicals that are generalists, so they will kill all insects and it will get into the systems of other animals too. Yes.
Can you tell me how you, what's required for maintenance on a bat box, and how high do they go?
So the question was, what is required maintenance on bat boxes and how high should they go? You don't have to do anything to maintain it. You just have to get it high enough up. I don't know how high off the top of my head, but what I will do is when I send out my resources in an email, I will connect you guys to an instructable about bat boxes, but it is pretty high up. It's not like a nest box for a bird. It's like twice as high. Yep.
But that's how we maintain is that very good news, because you just have to get it up there one time.
The biggest issue with bat boxes is squirrels. So they will often, flying squirrels will get into them, and even maybe snakes too, but they're not super destructive like rodents are. So that would be probably the only maintenance that would come up.
Yeah, I read they just post some about 10 to 12 feet up on a building. Side of the building. That way the predators can't get into the box. Yeah, it's about 15 feet. And the only maintenance is underneath it, you get bats. Why not? But they take care of mosquitoes.
All right, we have time for one more question. Do we have any more people that want to ask?
I have a question. I want to know about, you mentioned detention and retention ponds and planting them. And I have a detention pond and it empties. And you showed retention ponds, I think. And so would you just discuss maybe the difference between them and a little bit, and then tell me, and it might be, I don't want to just, I know it's big, probably a big answer too, but I'm sure there are requirements and with the city and whatever, but
So I
What-
don't know the requirements about maintaining those that infrastructure off the top of my head, but I work for Public Works and I can get that information. I think one thing to recognize is that those ponds in your neighborhood, they are the responsibility of the HOA or the property owners. So we get a lot of calls at Public Works for people, for the city to come out and fix the ponds. And that is not the role of the city, or in some cases, it might be Fulton County. I believe Martin's Landing used to be that Fulton County used to oversee Martin Lake. It is actually the responsibility of the private property owners. So that is what I can really address in terms of how you can plant those areas. It is worth looking up, but as in the stormwater department and in the stormwater manual, which is a state level EPD document, it is encouraged that a high percentage of that planting be native plants, and there's actually a list of plants that you can get. Of course, it's a technical manual, but what I can do is look into it and get back to you all, because that is an important piece that we all share. It is also important to wildlife too.
thank you.
Okay, well, Nikki, thank you. That was fantastic. And I know we took a lot of notes and everybody's thinking, I want my yard to be certified.
I will send these slides. Now there's a lot, like I said, grab the resources and I will email a list of resources, but these are, this is from the wildlife people. So I'll make sure you guys have those lists.
Also, we have Ask a Master Gardener booths that we do throughout the area. And if you have any handouts that we could, you know, give to the public, that'd be great.
Sure, I can
Yeah.
certainly provide
Yeah.
handouts. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much, everybody. We have about 5 minutes. So go and get yourself refreshed.